Hello everybody, Jose Rodriguez here. It is a couple of days past Christmas Day, and I want to thank everyone for your support this past year. It's been amazing for the channel and myself. So thank you so much again, and I hope everyone had a wonderful Christmas and looking forward to a wonderful New Year's. Don't party too much now. I'm staying home. I'm not even going to step outside, to tell you the truth. I'm going to watch that event in Manhattan on my TV. But anyway, I wanted to discuss two things that I just read about just recently. In fact, today, I've been staying away from messing around with the channel practically all week. I needed a long rest from the chores that it is to keep up with the channels and the questions and videos and that sort of thing. But anyway, this has to be discussed. Someone was having some problems. This is going to be two non-related questions actually that were answered. I could do two videos, but I really don't feel like doing that. We'll just discuss it all in the same video. One was some weird scratches, and not just on the edge of the paper, like it mostly occurs if you have a curly paper or a paper that's too thick and you didn't set your gap correctly, and your print head then enters and sort of scrapes or at least smears some ink on the edges, but not necessarily over the surface of the paper, because by then the paper is held down nice and flat by the rollers. So what could be going on? These scratches, and I mean literally like somebody took sandpaper and rubbed them across random areas on this big print this poor person was making. And I feel for him because it happened to me. I was using a particular paper, I'm not going to name it, but it's a really, really good one that's no longer made. I wonder why. And I tried it on my P800. When that P800 that's over there now used to be here before this baby came along. And so here's what was happening. I kept hearing literally scraping, and I swear the emulsion or the coating was literally being scraped off. It looked like many little claws just doing this. And I thought, oh Lord, what's going on here? What could possibly be wrong with my printhead assembly? What is underneath causing this? It's supposed to be smooth. It's supposed to be nothing should be scratching any part of the print surface, especially once it is held down. You know what I mean? So, okay, so finally, I opened up the printer's lid, which often it doesn't let you do, but in this case, apparently the P800 allows you to do that. And I literally saw that the paper had buckled in many areas, depending on the amount of ink being laid down. I said, what the heck? That cannot be happening. That doesn't happen when I make a smaller print. It only happened when I made large prints. And again, just weird. Apparently, the settings that the paper's manufacturers were recommending caused too much ink density. In other words, too much ink liquid, if you will, to be laid down. And that was causing just random areas of the paper to literally buckle up. In other words, they were actually rising above and going beyond the clearance between the printer's nozzle plate and the surface of the paper, which is supposed to be perfectly flat. On a RC coated paper, that would never happen, okay? But this was one of those fine art, super, super luscious papers. And yeah, it buckled. So I looked high and low for a solution for this. I discussed this before this question was asked a long time ago, okay? You might go back and search and maybe find that. I had to literally adjust the ink density. I had to adjust the gap. I mean, custom adjust it to a fairly wide gap. I need to set it to a very slow pass and a halt. In other words, a wait, pass to the right and wait. And in fact, I ended up doing unidirectional printing because I needed that paper to at least have a chance to begin to dry with a lower density of ink. And I did it until I began to see differences. In other words, the ramp that I used, black to white, by the way, ended up coming out a little bit too light. So I increased the density again until it was just right, but not to the point where I had it set before using a standard paper choice. Weird. So you need to play around with that. You need to adjust your ink density. You need to adjust your plating gap and begin to use unidirectional printing. In other words, the printhead will print, return, wait. The paper advances, and the cycle is repeated. That way the paper has a chance at least to begin to dry and not buckle up so much. This will only happen with a certain family of papers. These very absorbent rag type papers have a tendency to do that. And if it's a Barita coated, oh, really, really sensitive to even the slightest bit of contact from the printhead, or your hands for that matter. They are very delicate, and you need to be very careful when you're printing on these papers. Manhandling them can scratch them. Sometimes little flakes from the coating will fall off after you print and give you a little white spot. Okay, so you got to be really careful. What I'd like to do with these papers is give it a good gentle brushing with a very wide 4-inch, very soft brush for house painting, but it's got to be really soft. And just wipe off any kind of loose particles, any kind of the lint, because remember, these are not resin coated. So the paper fibers can, and sometimes do, come loose. And if they land on top of the paper and you print over that, they're going to fall off after the print job, and you're going to have white lines or little white spots in the case of flakes of the coating. Yeah, really tricky. So it took me about a month, believe it or not, to get my settings just right so that I was laying down the minimum amount of ink. I was letting the printhead go as slow as possible. In other words, with a pause between each pass. And I had to set the gap to a very wide setting. And you could do that in the P800 driver. All of that stuff is in there. So anyway, that is that. That was solved. And as it turned out, the paper was discontinued, and I ran out of it, and I just don't have any more. But that's something that can happen with other similar type papers. All right, the next question. P800 again, and a user was using the chipless solution firmware to turn your printer into an always full printer. In other words, the chips report always full. So does your maintenance cartridge. It will look empty regardless of how much ink you're dumping into it. So you got to keep really good close check on those cartridges. So he didn't want to bother with 80 milliliter cartridges. I guess it was a pain in the neck for him to check once a month. I couldn't imagine that. But anyway, that's what it was. And he bought 180 milliliter cartridges from China. Yeah. And so, yeah, now I don't have to check for maybe every 6 months. Well, here's the catch. Well, first of all, those cartridges don't fit. You cannot close the lid. You have to keep it open. You have to fool the sensor to allow you to keep that lid open and make it think that the lid is actually closed. So then, here's what happens mechanically. Yeah, it all sounds wonderful, by the way. Yeah, 180 milliliters of ink. Gosh, I never hardly ever have to check. And besides, the lid is open, I can constantly see how much ink is left. Here's the problem. The pressurization pump is calibrated to work with 80 milliliter cartridges. So as that bag is depleted, and these cartridges don't have bags, okay? But your OEM cartridges do. So as the bag is depleted, the internal space left between that bag and the sealing mylar cover on the cartridge, it needs to be pressurized. And the pump and the system is actually calibrated expecting to have a certain amount of space to pressurize, not a huge amount of space to pressurize. Okay. If you go beyond 80 milliliters, you cannot be assured that your cartridges will then be kept at the correct optimal operating pressure. Say you have used, oh gosh, 160 milliliters of ink. Well, that's twice as much ink, and you now created twice as much space that you need to keep pressurized. Even if the pump can do it, it's going to stress the pump because it's going to have to work twice as hard. Yeah. So again, sounds wonderful, sure. Oh, I wish I had a gallon tank each. Then I never have to refill except once every 10 years or whatever, right? No, that's not going to work. The pump expects to see 80 milliliters of ink in equal amount of space created as you use up all of the ink in your cartridge. Well, almost 80. Actually, the bag takes a bit of room. So you know what I mean, though. It expects to have a certain amount of space to keep pressurized, not a huge cavernous amount of space. Okay, so be careful with those. Yeah, they sound wonderful, but I would never, ever, 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 oh, I gotta say ever one more time, ever put a set of those cartridges on my P800, even if I have the chipless solution or not. I don't like them. I don't like them at all. And I really don't recommend them. Now, you could go ahead and try them. If they work for you, great. Great, but not for me. I would never, ever use one of those when I can just use the 80 milliliter refillables, or even I could modify my own OEM ones. That would be the best ink delivery, I mean, in the world, as opposed to refillable cartridges, which do not come up to par as far as OEM cartridges themselves. Okay, so this is highly opinionated. Take it with a grain of salt. Just remember, I would never do that. Okay, I would never consider doing that. All right, thank you so much. That's it. Maybe tomorrow I will upload some more stuff if we have time. We're taking our son and Nathan down to Union Station in Washington, D.C. It is a yearly tradition at Christmas. We take the metro. The kid loves it. He sits with Grandpa. We go through the tunnels. We go underground. We see the big train yard and all of that good stuff, and we just have a blast. We'll have lunch there and then head on home and enjoy the rest of the day. All right, so that is it. Now remember, Sunday evening, live stream from now on every Sunday evening at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, or Eastern Time, whatever, United States. All right, that is it for now. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and like, and happy printing, everybody. Bye-bye.